Hi, welcome back. I can't believe it's been this long. It seems like it was just the other day I was recording a video for you, and now it's been 2 whole weeks. I wish I could say I've been spending this time preparing something extra special for you, but I've actually been busy with other projects, so this is just normal amounts of special. Also, uh, look at me. I think I was wearing something summer weight last time I recorded, and now I'm all decked out for winter already. Anyways, let me see if I remember how to do this. I think I pull up my notes and start sharing. We're still in the midst of our deep dive into 1936 and return today to talk about Comics Magazine Company again. I had shared before that William Cook thought he was really onto something that was going to set his company apart if he printed longer stories per issue, doubling from 4 to 8 pages what his competition was offering. By September of 1936, Cook was ready to double down on that. Funny Pages would still offer a mix of comedy and adventure. Every story in this title would be 7 or 8 pages long. The subscription ad in issue number 1 calls these stories that live and breathe, though maybe it would be more accurate to call them stories with room to breathe. And this title is, of course, Funny Picture Stories, which is kind of ironic since they've abandoned humor almost entirely for adventure in this title. The creative staff was a mix of new and old names. George Brunner had been recommended to Cook by Everett Arnold, a printing press salesman who had a sights on entering the comic book field himself. Brunner was an athletic young man from Brooklyn who was a football scout for Brown University, but somehow came to the conclusion that there was more money in comic books. The character he came up with would have actually been more at home at Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's pulp-inspired comic book line, for the Clock was a masked vigilante very much in the mold of pulp fiction heroes like the Shadow and the Spider. I wrote a book once with 3 pages of analysis about the Clock in it. I'll share some of it here. Brian O'Brien, yes, that's the Clock's real name, was a district attorney and a great criminologist in a big city that is never named, but is almost surely New York City. He was also an All-American fullback and polo player, both of which made sense given Brunner's background in sports. Frustrated with the inability of the law to end crime and corruption, he sets about doing it himself, concealing his identity behind a black mask just hanging in front of his face from his hat, and calling himself the Clock. The name comes from O'Brien's love of wordplay because, as in his calling cards, the Clock is striking at crime. Brian's playful nature can also be seen in his teasing rivalry with Police Captain Kane, sending him handwritten letters after solving cases explaining how he did it. But the Clock has a darker side too, as evidenced by his willingness to turn criminals over to mob violence, or the ease with which he accepts the accidental death of criminals he was after, or the torture chamber in the sub-basement under his home that serves as the Clock's sanctuary. In a sanctuary, the Clock has file cabinets full of records on people, probably culled from police files that he saw as DA. He also keeps a meticulous journal on his war on crime, including how he uses torture to get confessions. This diary of evidence, the handwritten letters to Kane, the flimsiness with which Brian conceals his identity, maybe a stiff breeze would blow that mask away, or his hat off, though it is never spelled out. It all suggests that the Clock wants to get caught someday and punished for his own crimes. It is, after all, only a matter of time. That deep analysis might suggest to the listener that I have a great appreciation of Brunner's handiwork. You'd be wrong. Brunner only holds the distinction of coming in first, this being the very first masked vigilante in comic books. His artwork, apparently bereft of any formal education, never rises above stiff and amateurish. I think it's interesting that today, if you wanted to draw comic books but weren't good at it, you wouldn't get to make comic books. But back then, if you wanted to draw comic books and weren't good at it, they'd bump you up to editor. However, Brunner's ascent to editorship at Quality Comics is a story for a much later day. Joe Baresh is an artist with a loose style somewhere between cartoony and realistic that he could use in both types of stories. He had got a start with Comics Magazine earlier that year, drawing the cartoony Hezzy of the Hills for funny pages. In funny picture stories, he was able to tell different types of stories using one-shot characters we never see again except in reprints. Two favorites of mine that I reprinted myself, the comedy Double Trouble, and my absolute favorite of his, the serious adventure The Swamp Rat. Like many of the early comic book artists, Joe had taken a correspondence course on cartooning and at least had that much formal art education. He's going to stop making comic book stories in 1939 to focus for the rest of his career on being a gag cartoonist in comic books and magazines, most notably the syndicated cartoon Dynamite that ran from the 1950s to the 1980s. You already know that I like John Patterson from the attention that I lavished on his ongoing feature Skipper Ham Shanks. He introduces a more serious character in Rat Larson, the villain in two stories in A Hoodlum of the High Seas. He faces a different protagonist each time, though both men oddly wear the exact same shirt. I reprinted the second story, Smuggled Toys. John is going to leave comic books in 1939 and, according to comics.org, go into politics. Debuting in issue number 1 and having another story in the following issue is Bert Christman. Bert was both his pen name and his real middle name. His full name was Alan Bert Christman. I can't find any information about where Christman got his art training, but he's clearly in a higher league than any of the other artists in funny picture stories. His artwork might also have looked familiar to readers at the time because Christman was already doing the art of the Aviator comic strip Scorchy Smith. That's right, while others were getting into comic books so they could break into comic strips, Christman got into comic strips first, but then was attracted to the new field of comic books. For Comics Magazine, he's going to do 4 stories featuring the Spinner. And no, that's not a superhero, just spins really fast. He's an old man that starts telling a story, and that becomes the framing device for the rest of the story using new characters. Either Christman didn't like working for Comics Magazine or he got too busy with Scorchy Smith because he won't come back to comic books until 1939 when he creates the character for National called The Sandman. And that's a story for another time. Bye for now.